Oklahoma is the land of second, third, and last chances. Who were the people that made it so? The Red River Institute, JohnJDwyer.com, me, Gwen Faulconer-Lippert, and our signature sponsor, Atwoods, present Oklahoma Gold. Together with award-winning author and historian John J. Dwyer, we'll stitch the golden threads of Oklahoma history. Here now on Oklahoma Gold. Dignifying our history through the stories you're not going to believe. County Commissioner criminal scandals? John J. Dwyer, what's this story?
Well, Gwen, one of the themes of Oklahoma Gold, as well as our book, Oklahomans 2, which chronicles our state's history from statehood through the 2020s, is how over and over again, folks have abused their freedom, twisted it to their own perceived gain, and harmed many other people by doing so. Yes, it is sadly true that Oklahoma has had many chapters of political corruption, and some of those have been truly historic, even on a national scale, in their scope and impact. It's also true, however, and this is where some of the historians leave off, and even though it's far less known, that always, though often now forgotten, someone did stand up to say and do the right thing, to confront the wrongdoing, and to give us modern-day Oklahomans as an example to follow. Even when it was unpopular, when it was painful, when it was even dangerous, even when they got clobbered for doing so. Perhaps another way of putting this is that we've always had heroic men and women who, through the twin callings of freedom and responsibility that stretch back not just to America's founding fathers, but farther back to what I call our founding grandfathers, the Pilgrims and Puritans, have sought to be a light to our own people and as a city on a hill, even to all the nations. Thus we come today, and next time, 2 programs, to something really big, OKSCAM, the infamous Oklahoma County Commissioners scandal, and therein to Bill Price, native Oklahoman. And by the way, to learn much more about Bill, I recommend noted Oklahoma author Michael Hightower's powerful book, At War with Corruption, which is a Bill Price biography. Indeed, here's a man who might be most remembered for his unsuccessful races for governor and Congress. But what he should be remembered for and learn from as a shining exemplar are his ceaseless efforts in the 1970s and 80s to serve the people of Oklahoma from the United States Attorney for Western Oklahoma's office. He did so most powerfully and lastingly through the County Commissioner scandal. If you're an older listener, you're likely familiar at least with the name of this criminal conspiracy. You may remember it. If you're younger, you may or may not have even heard of it. But few of us realize just how widespread and ruinous it was to Oklahoma and its people. Fewer still how it was finally stopped. For OKSCAM was the largest political corruption case in American history to that point. It revealed a sprawling, decades-long pattern of bribery and corruption on the part of county officials around the state. It was a sad and sobering case, Gwen, of how easy it is to criticize the other people's political leaders, internationally, nationally, statewide, or in another district. But how when it's our guy who's a friendly fellow and maybe even does us favors from time to time, well, that's local government in action, not a criminal swamp or cesspool. So what was OKSCAM, the county commissioner scandal, all about? Well, let's go back to the beginning, or actually not the beginning, but the beginning of the end, as it turned out. In the words of Stevens County Grand Jury member J.L. Bias of Duncan, if those county commissioners had just fixed the potholes in that lady's road, the story might never have come to light. Now, that lady was Stevens County mother, Mrs. Billy McCarty. She feared the poor condition of county bridges she had to traverse while driving her children to school. Her anger grew as she learned of the enormous quantities of timber that county commissioners purchased while they continued to ignore her bridge concerns. Finally, in that great American spirit of the little guy rising up against corrupt power, Mrs. McCarty, and she's so lost to history I couldn't even find her own first name anywhere, launched a petition drive that successfully called a grand jury.
When was this?
This was in the late 1970s. I'm going to say around 77 or something like that. Well, that grand jury body, chaired by 7 months pregnant, early 20-something Debbie Dixon of Duncan, took their task of investigating the purchasing practices of the commissioners dead serious. Little did McCarty or anyone else know how difficult, even dangerous, it would prove. Nor could they suspect that her dogged bravery, Miss McCarty, together with that of a Stevens County grand jury comprised mostly of senior citizens and led by a pregnant young mother, would, despite the contempt shown all of them by county officials, lead to OKSCAM, the greatest political corruption scandal to that point in American history. It was also one of the longest running. Way back in the late 1950s, Democratic State Senator Hugh Sandlin of Holdenville chaired a select legislative committee that investigated the many reported corrupt purchasing practices of Oklahoma County commissioners. The Sandlin report detailed dozens of such patterns that were as corrosive to the culture and economics of the financially struggling state as they were deeply embedded. A spawning ground for corruption, the committee summarized. So what was the Democratic-dominated legislature's reaction to this, in the words of one historian? To leave the existing system in place. Then, Kennedy-esque young Democratic Governor J. Howard Edmondson, buoyed by successfully championing several large state government reforms, rolled up his sleeves, turned to the county level, and tackled the same beast. The result? He found allies among the commissioners themselves or their legislative cousins nearly as rare as July snowfall in Oklahoma. Edmondson's foes correctly perceived his efforts as part of his strategy to deliver the state from the often crooked, unconstitutionally disproportionate influence of rural legislative chieftains. They sought not just to defeat the idealistic governor, but to destroy him. Politically, they succeeded. In less than 2 years, wrote another historian, Edmondson had lost party control, legislative command, and his faintly remembered mandate as well. Not yet 40 years old when he left office in the early 1960s, Edmondson would never win another election. Taking on OKSCAM, Gwen, as it turned out, was a dangerous undertaking.
And they were purchasing too much and then pocketing it?
That's right. They were actually buying plenty, but in collusion with suppliers. Buying it was one thing. Actually delivering it or even picking it up was an entirely different thing. And we're talking in the millions of dollars.
So somehow this money ended up in the commissioner's pockets? Greed. It's ugly.
Well, the Bible does say, it doesn't say money is itself evil. It just says the love of it is the root of all sorts of evil.
And so in Duncan, the woman who started all the investigation, you can't even find her first name?
No, nowhere. No newspaper accounts, people from Duncan. And I got to give a shout out to my buddy Steve Bias, editor of our Oklahomans books. That was his father, J.L. Bias, former 82nd Division Screaming Eagle paratrooper that was on that grand jury with a young pregnant mother, Debbie Dixon.
I can hardly wait to hear what happens. This is Oklahoma Gold, the Golden Nugget, when we return. Dignifying our history by the stories we remember. The greed of the 1970s from the county commissioner scandal. OKSCAM. John J. Dwyer, tell me more.
Great name, isn't it? OKSCAM. Well, if Debbie Dixon, the pregnant mother leader of the grand jury, J.L. Bias, and their fellow Stevens County grand jury members knew the dangers of offending Oklahoma County commissioners, they certainly didn't let it affect their efforts. In fact, the more evidence they compiled of bridge lumber, and here's for your wonder what these guys actually do wrong. Bridge lumber that was purchased but never installed, or metal tin horns that were bought but never even delivered. The less enthusiastic the local district attorney, judge, or courthouse population in general seemed toward acting upon those astonishing revelations. J.L. Bias, the former 82nd airborne paratrooper, recalled the grand jury on which he served, finding the district attorney as difficult to deal with as the county commissioners. Bias in the grand jury quickly became convinced that the latter were in fact engaged in a massive criminal conspiracy to hijack the public's hard-earned tax dollars into their own pockets and those of their fellow conspirators. Over and over, the grand jury would collect damning evidence against the commissioners and submit it to the district attorney, only to have him soften or dilute the content. They did not want to investigate those county commissioners, Bias told me. Politics was definitely alive. That was as much as I get Debbie Dixon to tell me. Well, meanwhile, Charles Muse of the state auditor's office was compiling an inventory of nearly $2 million worth of unaccounted for funds just in Stevens County. While doing so, he was followed by unknown persons as he drove, and he received threatening phone calls. According to Muse, the experience was, quote, no picnic. Well, the grand jury of Stevens County's June 1978 report charged 4 Oklahoma materials suppliers with 14 counts of fraud against Stevens County. It also indicted 2 of the county's 3 commissioners for failure to account for $1 million in funds, approximately $4 million in 2020 dollars, as well as gross neglect of duty. In the face of this barrage of criminal activity, the district attorney filed the charges in such a manner as to be only misdemeanors. This incongruity, the DA's own soon recusal of himself from the case, as well as that of the district judge, produced a succession of delays that resulted in no charges at all being filed against the Stevens County commissioners.
No charges at all?
Yeah, and this hurts because as you know, I grew up in Duncan, and one investigator said a Duncan Banner newspaper reporter confided to him that no one around the county courthouse wanted to proceed with the case. State Auditor Muse, meanwhile, presented his sobering evidence to the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. He was surprised to learn that the OSBI apparently forwarded it to the county commissioners themselves. Not so surprising was that no one was charged with anything on a state level. Meanwhile, Tom Daxon won a startling election as the state auditor and inspector later in 1978. He became the only statewide Republican office holder. Daxon himself marshaled the evidence collected by Muse and others on his auditing team against numerous county commissioners and presented it to various state prosecutors around the state. None took action. Regarding the Stevens County DA's request that the grand jury looking into county commissioner purchasing soften the report, grand jury forewoman Debbie Dixon, the 7 months pregnant, early 20s-something young lady, illumined one of the long-standing barriers to cleaning up Oklahoma County corruption. In small towns where leaders know one another personally, she said, it's probably very difficult to do your job when it's against a good friend, end quote. And it might be supposed in the case of the DAs when it's against the folks who influence many of the citizens whose votes you need for re-election, your county commissioners. Those preeminent exemplars of the local government that we Oklahomans have historically claimed as a pillar of the Constitution remain seemingly invincible in their corruption. Our golden nugget this time, though, Gwen, is that the efforts of those common everyday men and women in Stevens County, as well as those outliers, Daxon and Muse in the state auditor's office, had launched a years-long saga that would be joined by the aforementioned native Oklahoman and U.S. Attorney Bill Price. And determined as many county commissioners were in their corruption, Bill Price would prove even more determined to bring them to justice.
So it started with the Stevens County commissioners, and then the more they investigated, the more the other county commissioners were doing the same thing?
Yeah, and what we see is a web that begins to interlock, that you have this bunch of feisty Stevens County common citizens working on one level being frustrated. Then you have a few people on the state level carrying out the duties of their office to look after the money of the people of the state, and they're themselves getting stonewalled. And what we're going to see in the next program is how these intrepid pursuers of truth eventually get connected finally.
Now that's Oklahoma Gold. Oklahoma is the land of second, third, and last chances. Who were the people that made it so? The Red River Institute, JohnJDwyer.com, me, Gwen Faulconer Lippert, and our signature sponsor, Atwoods, present Oklahoma Gold. Together with award-winning author and historian John J. Dwyer, we'll stitch the golden threads of Oklahoma history. Here now on Oklahoma Gold. Dignifying our history by the stories you're not going to believe. Oklahoma Gold. John J. Dwyer, it all started because a county commissioner wouldn't fix a pothole?
That's right, Gwen. Stevens County, my old stomping grounds of Duncan. And today we're going to continue that story of the greatest American political scandal in history to that date, OKSCAM, the long and infamous county commissioners conspiracy. Yeah, Ms. Billy McCarty, they wouldn't fix that bridge. She was afraid when she would take her kids over it to school. But yet she knew money was pouring into the commissioners' coffers to do exactly those things, fix bridges. And last time, indeed, we talked about how the gritty citizens of Duncan, Marlow, Comanche, and other small Stevens County towns and countryside had achieved what no one else in 3/4 of a century of Oklahoma statehood had. They'd come within an eyelash of getting their corrupt kings of local government indicted for felonies. Their efforts, though, were not in vain. They had connected the dots between their local county commissioners and a female materials supplier named Dorothy Griffin across the state in the remote southeastern hamlet of Ferris. They'd also brought Charles Muse from the state auditor's office into the loop. This, in turn, accelerated the engagement of Muse's new boss, State Auditor Tom Daxon, which was soon to prove a game changer. These intrepid citizens endure as exemplars of how, no matter how dark the chapter in Oklahoma history, courageous men and women have always stood up to speak and do the right thing, even when at great cost to themselves. And regarding OKSCAM, another Oklahoman had long suspected county commissioners of wrongdoing. Oklahoma City native Bill Price had been named the outstanding Assistant U.S. Attorney in America for 3 straight years, 1977 through 79, for his unexcelled performance in the agency's Western Oklahoma office in Oklahoma City. Well, when Tom Daxon took office as state auditor in 1979, after overcoming the enormous political handicap of being a Republican, he approached fellow party member and close friend Bill Price. It was the first time a state official had ever actively engaged U.S. Attorney Price. Daxon shared his pile of evidence against the commissioners in Stevens and other counties across the state. Price took the information compiled by Debbie Dixon, J.L. Bias, and their Stevens County grand jury on Dorothy Griffin and her thriving lumber yard and rightly perceived her potential legal exposure. Nonetheless, for many months, the state's thicket of friendly associations among public officials, coupled with the era's archaic laws against legal jurisdictions exchanging evidence and information, kept him from finding an entry point into a prosecution. One day while lunching with a friend who worked for the Oklahoma City office of the IRS, however, Price shrewdly discerned, without actually being directly told, that that organization, too, was investigating Dorothy Griffin's relationship with county commissioners. Price boldly bridged the interagency chasm in information sharing. He persuaded his friend, and subsequently the IRS organization, to merge their efforts with himself and the OKC, Tulsa, and Muskogee U.S. Attorney's offices. Together, they would seek to penetrate the shroud around commissioner wheeling and dealing in what was then coming to be known as OKSCAM. Bill Price shared crucial intelligence with the IRS agents that they did not have. He pointed them to Dorothy Griffin, who was desperately trying to provide financially for an ill husband and family. The agents combined Price's intel with their own to persuade the repentant Griffin to come clean. It didn't hurt when one corrupt Stevens County supplier suggested to Dorothy Griffin that she should burn down her own house to destroy evidence. Well, Griffin began to wonder whether she might wind up in such a fire herself. Stranger things have happened in Oklahoma history, after all. She decided she actually felt much safer with the respectful, gentlemanly federal lawmen, some of them, like Price, Oklahomans, who would likely send her to prison than she did the coarse renegades who had paid her many thousands of dollars. Bill Price quarterbacked the entire unfolding operation. He astutely weaponized Griffin, which produced the first success in reeling in a crooked major supplier to the commissioners. She had provided counterfeit paperwork to that man that, when combined with that to similar suppliers, totaled many millions of dollars of Oklahoma citizens' tax money. All of it had been hijacked in the pockets of corrupt commissioners, suppliers, and other conspirators. Price then put both Griffin and the supplier into statewide play, armed with secret recording devices. He did the same with the valiant Rufus Young of Wagner County, the only county commissioner who volunteered to help corral his tarnished peers. Young posed as a commissioner on the take. He bravely defied a series of written and phone threats on his life, ridicule from other county commissioners, and repeated kickback offers before and during his undercover work. Apparently, one group respected Young, however, his actual constituents, who proceeded to re-elect him. The FBI awarded him its highest honor, the Lewis E. Peters Memorial Award, in 1982. Rufus Young drove a dump truck the last 10 years of his life. Upon his death in 2008, his wife Pamela told the Tulsa World, "He always felt it was the right thing to do. He was that kind of man, right to the end." Well, Gwen, these taped conversations that were made possible by brave men and women who were scared, no doubt, the whole time, incriminated hundreds of OKSCAM lawbreakers who heretofore have been shielded by an impenetrable veil of secrecy and deception. And after the break, we'll see how Bill Price and his colleagues, which includes one man well known to Oklahomans, tied the knot on this heretofore unstoppable criminal conspiracy.
You know what I really appreciate about the Oklahomans Volume 2 is you bring us the names of the people that made the difference. We know the names of the scandalous, but you bring out the heroes.
Well, you know, Gwen, and we've talked about this before, whether it was this county commissioner scandal or the follies of the oil bust in the late 70s, or actually the 80s, the burning of Greenwood in 1921, the Supreme Court scandal in the 60s. I don't want to teach my children and grandchildren that we're just a bunch of, thugs and thieves, because that's not the whole story. Because the only reason we even know about most of these things is because there were people that put their own safety on the line to confront evil. In every one of those cases, as you said, in Oklahoma's 2, we name the names of not just the villains, but the heroes that stood up to them.
I wonder what the golden nugget's going to be. This is Oklahoma Gold. Dignifying our history by the stories and numbers we remember. What about the heroes, John J. Dwyer? Tell me about the OKSCAM by the numbers.
Well, we're going to see some ugly numbers here in a minute as far as when the tab was finally compiled of what, at least a pale estimate of what the criminal conspiracy of the county commissioners for many decades cost us.
And they were elected officials. We should also revisit the fact that there were more Democrats than Republicans back then statewide.
Well, Gwen, you're right. Tom Daxon, Bill Price, Frank Keating, who was another attorney that went with this alongside Bill Price, they were all Republicans. And I think there's a lesson here for all of us, that not necessarily about party affiliation, but that even when you're in the minority, or even when you're outnumbered, outgunned, whatever, you can make a difference. Sometimes it takes a long time. That grand jury in Duncan, in 1977, it wasn't until the 80s that people started getting convicted. So I'm sure there was a lot of frustration and wondering that happened. But I think the lesson here is, and for our young people, is don't throw in the towel just because you're outnumbered or behind on the scoreboard. And in fact, once roped in through their own incriminating taped conversations, these county commissioners, and the sordid paper trail illuminating them, many of them and their suppliers, not surprisingly, tried to lie their way out of trouble. U.S. Attorney Bill Price expected that. Aren't we shocked? And he put the hammer down on them. If you don't cooperate, we'll convict you, he told them. After we convict you, we'll ask a judge to grant you immunity and we'll compel you to testify. The Fifth Amendment doesn't call on you to protect your friends, only yourself. You'll sit in the county jail for maybe a year before you testify. And now that time doesn't count on your present term. You may think now you will refuse and stick to it, but at some point you will have to testify. Your only other choice is to lie, and you do that and we'll indict you for perjury, end quote. Well, Bill Price determined that across 3/4 of a century, corrupt good old boy commissioners purchased county materials and equipment from suppliers whose bids were high in order to incorporate financial kickbacks to the commissioners. When an honest vendor, of whom Oklahoma had many, were to appear dishonest, commissioners had a whole playbook of methods to thwart them. Often, as prices rose with continued job awards to bribing suppliers, the law-abiding ones would drop out, leaving the field to their law-breaking competitors. If the honest suppliers persisted in bidding, commissioners would delete them from bid lists, invite only favored bidders, and even delete records of the low, honest bids. Gwen, perhaps these good old boy criminals fail to consider how their own selfish greed impacted their fellow Oklahomans. According to Bill Price, equipment and supplies purchased by the state's county commissioners cost 40% more on average. That's for every tin horn, every bridge, every piece of lumber than they did in neighboring Kansas. Yet as soon as lawmen brought the outlaws to justice, he said, Oklahoma's cost for these goods mirrored Kansas. Errant commissioners may also have overlooked the danger they placed their fellow citizens and their children under, including dangerous roads and bridges, whose materials they channeled instead to friends and fellow thieves or never even purchased at all. Or how about the sorry hypocrisy they demonstrated to the young people of their communities, as many of them led their churches and other civic groups and instructed those young people to do what was right, even when the crowd acted up. In the end, 230 people were convicted of OKSCAM-related crimes, 110 of them county commissioners. The fraud embroiled at least 60 of the state's 77 counties, to the tune of, by the numbers, Gwen, hundreds of millions of dollars, likely running into the billions if you go back to statehood, which was probably about when it started. Far from glorying in or gloating over his and his colleagues' success, however, Bill Price said simply, my joy in this office isn't that one more criminal goes to jail. My joy is to deter people, to make sure crime doesn't happen again. And Gwen, our golden nugget, and perhaps the best valedictory to the long saga of Oklahoma's county commissioner scandal and the intrepid men and women who stopped it, came from an unlikely source. Marty Hahn was one of the roughest, toughest political operatives and commentators in Oklahoma history, and a Democrat too. Regarding Price's statement about deterring crime, as well as Price's subsequent loss in the gubernatorial and congressional elections, Hahn declared, quote, he succeeded in doing that, deterring crime, better, especially for Oklahoma, than anyone who came before. He has a beautiful wife and 3 wonderful kids. He sleeps soundly, no doubts about himself or regret over past acts. That comes from a background of hard work, integrity, and ability. A guy with these qualities doesn't need to be governor. Of course, it wouldn't hurt if God blessed us with such a miracle more often.
Bill Price. Not a gun, but certain Oklahoma gold.